On a sunny morning in Jerusalem, the city vibrated with the hustle and bustle of people heading to the temple. Among the crowd, two figures stood out: a group of religious people, the Pharisees, with expressions of indignation and determination, and a woman, whose eyes reflected terror and humiliation. The woman, known for her sin, carried on her shoulders the weight of an accusation that put her on the brink of death: adultery. The sun shone brightly, but to her, the world seemed to darken as she approached the place where she would be judged. The Pharisees, men of law and tradition, had found an opportunity to expose not only the woman's error, but also to challenge the authority of Jesus, a rabbi who attracted followers and aroused the curiosity of the people. They gathered with a clear purpose: to catch him in his words, expose him in front of the crowd, and, who knows, discredit him. The woman felt like an object, a piece in a game she didn't fully understand. Fear consumed her, and what should have been a moment of dignity and redemption turned into a spectacle of damnation. The looks of the crowd were cruel. The anticipation in the air was palpable. The voices of the Pharisees were raised, bringing to light the law of Moses, which prescribed the death penalty for a woman caught in adultery. The woman, whose thoughts were tangled with shame and despair, wondered if there was any possibility of escaping this untenable situation. Could anyone, in the midst of so much condemnation, see beyond their error? What was left of her, if not the label of sinner? What was at stake was not just his life, but also his dignity and the chance for a new beginning. Jesus, who observed the scene with a serene gaze, was the only hope the woman had. However, she didn't know if he cared about her suffering or if he would also see her as a mere symbol of failure. The tension increased as the Pharisees insisted on a verdict, certain that the woman's condemnation could also mean Jesus' defeat. The moral dilemma was clear. If Jesus forgave her, he would be breaking the law. If he condemned her, he would lose the image of mercy he had built among those who followed him. Thus, the woman found herself at the center of a conflict that transcended her own existence. The murmur of the crowd intensified, and the feeling that her fate was about to be decided left her paralyzed. What happened next? The possibility of an act of compassion seemed distant, and the reality of imminent death surrounded her like a shadow. There was a burning desire that, even in the midst of so much injustice, a glimmer of grace could emerge. The woman, in her vulnerability, hoped that perhaps in the presence of Jesus, there would be a chance for a forgiveness that she herself did not dare to grant herself. And so, that morning, the stage was set for an encounter that could redefine not only that woman's destiny, but also her understanding of love and grace in a judgment-filled world. Expectation was in the air, as everyone anxiously awaited the outcome of this story that promised to be transformative. The morning unfolded in Jerusalem, and the city pulsed with the energy of a new day. But for the woman, each step toward the temple was a cruel reminder of her fragility. The weight of rejection and contempt oppressed her, while the voices of the Pharisees echoed in her mind like a deafening wail. "Look at her," exclaimed one of the Pharisees, pointing to her as if she were a trophy of his supposed righteousness. "The law is clear. We must act as Moses commanded. What do you say, Jesus?" The woman felt her heart race when she heard the name of the one who had the reputation of being a just and merciful man. But for a brief moment, she allowed herself to wonder, would he really care about me? Or am I just a pawn in a power game between these men? She remembered happier days, when life seemed full of promise. Yes, she had made mistakes, and her choice had led her down a path of pain. But deep down, he wanted more than condemnation. I longed for a glimpse of understanding and compassion. "If you are so wise, tell us what to do with her," insisted another Pharisee, with a cynical smile on his lips. "Should we follow the law, or should we ignore it in the face of its words of love?" On the other side, Jesus watched, his serene expression contrasting with the hustle and bustle around him. The Pharisees, in their search for a fight, did not realize that they were trapped in their own trap. He knew the issue wasn't just about the woman. It was about the essence of grace and forgiveness. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," Jesus finally responded, his calm voice cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. The words reverberated, and the crowd hesitated. The woman, overcome by terror, could not understand the depth of it. Every look around him seemed to carry a weight of judgment and anger. She wanted to scream, but the words were lost in her throat. The only thing left was the hope that, among all those around her, there was someone willing to see beyond her failure. Meanwhile, in the crowd, the Pharisees exchanged worried looks. The plan to discredit Jesus began to fall apart. They were men of law, but they were also human, and as they prepared to launch the next accusation, doubt began to creep into their hearts. "What if he's right?" one of them muttered, almost to himself. "What if we are the real sinners?" Deep in her soul, the woman wished that, somehow, Jesus could understand the depth of her pain. "If I could redeem myself, I would do anything," she thought, as a whirlwind of emotions consumed her. "But what does that mean if I can't change my past?" The tension in the air was becoming palpable. The crowd, once so bloodthirsty, began to waver, and a murmur of confusion spread. The moral dilemma that Jesus posed was not just a theological question. It was a light shed on the hypocrisy that permeated those who called themselves righteous. The woman, still on her knees, felt the dampness of the floor beneath her hands. "I am a sinner," she murmured to herself, an echo of her reality. "But am I just that? What if there's something more to me, something I can't see myself?" Jesus observed the woman, and in her eyes he saw not only pain, but the possibility of transformation. He knew that true forgiveness was not just a matter of absolution. It was an opportunity for rebirth. Yet each person's choice is a reflection of their own soul, thought Jesus, as he analyzed the faces in front of him. What they see now is a reflection of who they really are. The Pharisees, in their lust for control, were about to realize that in trying to condemn the woman, they had put their own lives on trial. Jesus, with calm firmness, challenged not only the woman, but everyone around her, to look within and confront their own flaws. "I do not condemn you," Jesus finally declared, addressing the woman. "Go and sin no more." At that moment, the woman felt a mixture of disbelief and relief. The weight that seemed to crush her lifted, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could take a step toward a new beginning. As the crowd began to disperse, the woman raised her head, no longer as a condemned woman, but as someone who, despite her pain, had found a path, however tenuous, to redemption. Amidst the chaos, a new cycle of life began, and the message of love and forgiveness echoed like a hymn of hope throughout the place. Sunlight filtered between the stones of the temple, creating a mosaic of shadows and light that danced around the woman. As she slowly stood up, a sense of freedom, however tenuous, began to well up within her. But this freedom soon turned into a deep restlessness. What would come next? Could the liberation of a moment really mean new life? Or was it just an illusion? The Pharisees, now in a state of confusion, began to whisper among themselves, their voices filled with indignation. What Jesus had said challenged not only what they stood for, but also the very structure that supported their power. The moral dilemma he had presented not only exposed them, but also forced them to question their own motivations. One of them, younger, looked tormented. What if he's right? What do we do with our own guilt, with our own hypocrisy? He murmured, his eyes restless. Jesus observed the scene with serenity, but inside, tension was growing. He knew that he had planted a seed of doubt among the religious leaders, and that seed, if cultivated, could challenge not only their authority, but also the very essence of their beliefs. As the woman walked away, her steps still hesitant, he felt the impact of his words would reverberate far beyond that moment. The woman, in turn, was fighting a whirlwind of emotions. I'm not just a sinner, she thought as she walked. There's something else in me, something that wants to be free. But freedom seemed a distant concept, shrouded in shadows of doubt. How could she trust a future that had condemned her so many times? The voices of the past still echoed in his mind, and each step toward the temple's exit was a painful reminder that full acceptance was still beyond his reach. Meanwhile, the Pharisees, in their distress, began to divide. Some, who had previously been firm in their condemnation, now looked at Jesus with a mixture of respect and fear. Others, however, were determined not to let this new perspective lead to a crisis of faith. We must reaffirm our position, one of them said in a firm voice, trying to maintain order among the group. We cannot allow mercy to become a pretext for impunity. The young Pharisee, who had expressed his doubts, felt the weight of the choice on his shoulders. He walked away from the group, looking for a quieter place where he could think. If Jesus is right, what does that mean for me? What if I am also worthy of forgiveness? He reflected, tormented. This new awareness left him vulnerable, and the idea of opposing his elders terrified him. But, on the other hand, the possibility of change fascinated him. He had grown up in a system that despised compassion, and now he found himself faced with a dilemma: follow tradition or seek the truth. In the woman's heart, the internal struggle was similar. If I allow myself to feel this freedom, what will it mean for my life? What if I fail again? What will happen if I try and fail? She asked herself as her steps took her away from the temple. The possibility of redemption was as heavy a burden as the guilt he had carried. She hesitated, fearing that the new life Jesus promised was just a mirage. In the midst of her emotional confusion, she spotted a group of women chatting excitedly. Some of them were familiar, others were strange. But what surprised her most was the way they spoke, as if they were discussing not just their lives but also their hopes and dreams. A small glimmer of hope lit up inside her. What if I could be part of this? What if I could rediscover who I am? He thought as he slowly approached. However, tension among the Pharisees was reaching its peak. The division became more evident, and voices of confrontation began to resonate. We cannot allow this to spread. If Jesus continues to preach like this, he could ruin everything we have built, said one of the leaders, with a look of determination. We need to silence him before it's too late. The woman, now closer to the group of women, felt the urgency of the situation. I'm not just a mistake, she whispered to herself as courage began to rise within her. I am an untold story, a future yet to be written. With this new perspective, she decided that she would not allow her life story to be defined by a single mistake. The decision to rewrite his destiny became clear, and the tension in his heart began to dissipate, giving way to hope. The challenge Jesus faced and the woman's internal struggle were intertwined, both reflecting the complexities of life and redemption. As the sun sank below the horizon, the city of Jerusalem remained on the threshold of transformation. Each person's choices began to have consequences, and the echo of the decisions they made reverberated in the streets, like a call for change that could not be ignored. The sunlight was slowly fading, plunging Jerusalem into a golden twilight, but the atmosphere in the temple was charged with electricity. The woman, now immersed in her thoughts, felt the weight of expectations on her shoulders. The group of women in front of her looked at her curiously, and she realized this could be an opportunity to connect, to find a new home where her story could be told with compassion. But the shadow of fear still accompanied her. What if I'm not accepted? What if I fail again? He thought, his heart racing. Meanwhile, the Pharisees were in a frenzy. The young man who had questioned the morality of the conviction was torn. He felt pressure from his peers, but the voice of Jesus still resonated in his mind. Who among you is without sin? The question echoed like a drum, beating loudly in his conscience. He knew he needed to make a decision. The choice between remaining loyal to what you had always believed or opening yourself to a new truth? What if, by remaining silent, I am perpetuating injustice? He asked, his eyes fixed on the ground as the others discussed fervently how to deal with Jesus. The conflict between tradition and compassion was about to explode. One of the Pharisees, with a raised voice, cried out, "We must confront him. If we don't act now, our authority will be challenged, and the people will begin to question everything we have built." The outrage reverberated, and he could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The young Pharisee, on the other hand, hesitated, his heart beating wildly. What if he's right? What do we do with our own guilt? He thought, peer pressure squeezing him like a snake. Meanwhile, the woman, now a few steps away from the group of women, felt the urge to approach. However, insecurity paralyzed her. If I join them, will they see me as just a sinner? Or will they be able to see the woman I want to become? She asked herself, the internal struggle becoming almost unbearable. The idea of exposing herself, of showing her vulnerabilities was terrifying, but at the same time, something inside her screamed for change. I can't continue to live in the shadow of my past, he decided, taking a deep breath, feeling the strength of determination growing. The young Pharisee, even from a distance, noticed the woman and her hesitations. Something about her posture, her search for acceptance, touched him deeply. He remembered his own struggle, how doubt tormented him. Maybe it's not just what I believe, but who I am that needs to change, he thought, as a new sense of purpose began to emerge. He walked away from the group, deciding that he needed to do something about it, something that could change not only his fate, but that of everyone around him. A scream cut through the air, coming from one of the Pharisees who was preparing to confront Jesus. Enough! We cannot allow him to continue deceiving the people. The tension in the air was palpable, as if a roaring storm was about to break loose. The young Pharisee looked at Jesus, who remained calm, and decided it was time to act. He felt like he could no longer remain silent. The compassion that had awakened within him was stronger than the fear of displeasing his superiors. The woman, noticing the turmoil growing, took courage. With firm steps, she approached the group of women. "I am more than my mistakes," he declared, his voice echoing through the noise. "I want to be part of this redemption story. I want to find my worth." The women, surprised, looked at her with a mix of empathy and admiration. Her courage was breaking down the barriers that isolated her. Meanwhile, the argument between the Pharisees intensified. The young man, now in front of his peers, felt it was his turn to speak. Jesus is not here to destroy us, but to show us that we are all lost in some way. We need to hear his message, not just condemn him. His words, filled with sincerity, cut through the heavy air like a blade, defying the tradition that surrounded him. He knew he was risking everything, but the need for truth was pushing him forward. The woman, now surrounded by women, felt a wave of support. "Together, we can be more than our past stories," one said encouragingly. The energy of the group began to shift, a cycle of encouragement and acceptance forming. The past would no longer define their lives. The climax was about to happen. At a defining moment, both the woman and the young Pharisee were about to make choices that could not only change their lives, but also impact the community around them. The tension between freedom and condemnation, between tradition and compassion, was at its highest point, and the city of Jerusalem eagerly awaited the outcome of these decisions. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of expectations, not just on me, but on everyone there. When the young Pharisee's words echoed, a wave of shock ran through the group. He had dared to challenge the current, and for a brief moment, silence took over the place. I felt my heart race, not just for him, but for the courage that was blossoming within me. I knew it wasn't just my story that was at stake, but that of all of us. The young man, who until then remained in the shadow of the Pharisees, now stood up as a light in the midst of darkness. We need to be honest about our mistakes. We all carry our own guilt, but it doesn't define us. His voice, although hesitant at first, was now clear and firm, resonating with unexpected power. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the battle between loyalty to tradition and the urgency of a new truth. He was ready to expose himself, just like me. As the Pharisees began to stir, whispers piercing the air with murmurs of disagreement and indignation, I knew it was my turn to act. I had to join him, the one who was challenging the status quo. With ragged breaths and shaking hands, I took a step forward, my eyes fixed on the young man. "He's right," I shouted, voice echoing with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "We need to stop hiding behind fear. We need compassion." The eyes turned to me, and confusion spread among the women and the Pharisees. The weight of condemnation that had followed me for so long was beginning to dissipate, like fog in the morning sun. If I'm just a sinner, then so be it. But I'm also a woman who seeks redemption, who wants to change, who wants to be accepted. The words came out with a fervor that I couldn't contain, each syllable cutting through the veil of silence that surrounded us. The Pharisees, now torn between indignation and curiosity, looked at us as if we were intruders in a space that belonged to them. The young Pharisee next to me seemed to find strength in my determination. "It's time to set aside our prejudices," he exclaimed, passion burning in his voice. "What Jesus teaches us is that we all deserve a second chance. He didn't come to judge us, but to show us the path to light." The atmosphere was electromagnetic, as if the temple itself was watching this moment unfold. Some Pharisees began to murmur, the resistance on their faces palpable. But there was also a glint of uncertainty, as if, for the first time, they were beginning to question the rigidity of their beliefs. What if we're wrong? I thought, feeling that change was within our reach. The woman next to me, one of the ones who had previously looked at me curiously, now approached. "Together, we can make a difference," she said, her voice firm. "We are not just sinners. We are human beings who seek love and acceptance." The union of our voices seemed to create a bond, a chain that grew stronger with each word. I looked around and saw other women joining us, firm in their decision to no longer let themselves be defined by the past. The Pharisees, now in a true identity crisis, were divided. One group demonstrated angrily, calling for punishment and the preservation of order, while another began to hesitate, questioning whether condemnation was really the right path. The tension was palpable, as if the air itself was thick with doubt. It was then that Jesus, who until then had remained silent, stepped forward, his presence radiating calm and firmness. "Who among you is without sin? Let him cast the first stone." His words fell like a cloak over us, and the murmur turned into a whisper of reflection. I saw the Pharisees, one by one, beginning to lower their eyes, the truth of the question echoing in their minds. Condemnation was not an answer, but a perpetuation of pain. Meanwhile, I kept my gaze fixed on Jesus, feeling a surge of hope. Finally, compassion was emerging, challenging the tradition that had kept us apart for so long. At that moment, I realized that the real struggle was not just mine, but the struggle of all of us who were looking for a new beginning. The climax of tension began to dissolve. The young Pharisee looked at me, and I saw the determination in his eyes. "Let us come together, not just as sinners, but as people who want a different future," he said, and his words were a call to action. The echo of his voice was turning into a symphony of hope, and I knew we were about to take a crucial step toward collective redemption. However, the consequences of our actions still hung in the air, like clouds waiting for a storm. The battle was just beginning, and the future was still uncertain. But for the first time, the light of hope shone brightly in our hearts, ready to face whatever came next. The journey of transformation was just beginning, and I felt like I was no longer alone. The silence that followed Jesus' words was almost palpable. I felt as if time had stopped, as the Pharisees began to scatter, each struggling with their own truths. I looked around and saw perplexed faces, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of anger and confusion. The tension was easing, but the weight of the choices we had made still hung over us. The young Pharisee next to me took a deep breath, clearly shaken but determined. "We need to continue this conversation," he said, his voice now softer but still carrying intensity. He turned to the small crowd of women now clustered around us. "You have a voice. Let's use it." The courage he had demonstrated was spreading, infecting those who were willing to listen. Meanwhile, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. What we did was just the beginning, but the future looked brighter. The women began to hug each other, joining in a bond of solidarity. One of them, who I recognized as a mother, with tears streaming down her face, said, "I didn't know I wasn't alone. Our stories connect." The echo of her words resonated with me, and I realized that each of us brought baggage of pain and hope. The Pharisees, amid the tumult, began to argue among themselves. Some seemed ready to retort, but others were visibly affected by the reflection proposed by Jesus. One of the elders, with a white beard and a strong voice, exclaimed, "How can we continue to condemn those who seek redemption?" This question hung in the air, a turning point that, unexpectedly, began to open space for previously unthinkable dialogues. The atmosphere was slowly changing. A group of men, who had previously remained on the sidelines, began to approach, attracted by the transformation that was taking place. They were not just spectators, but integral parts of this new narrative. One of them, a young man I knew by sight, asked, "Can I join you? I'm tired of living in the shadows of my own guilt." His voice was shaking, but there was a determination there, a desire to change. At that moment, I realized that the consequences of our actions were not just personal, but collective. A new reality was emerging, and we were the architects of that change. Conversations began to form in small groups, ideas being exchanged, experiences shared. Empathy was becoming the common thread that tied our stories together. I looked at the young Pharisee and saw that he was observing the scene with a shy but hopeful smile. He turned to me and said, "I never thought I'd see something like this. We need to continue to challenge these norms." The connection that had been established between us was strong, a recognition that we were on this journey together. The temple, which had once seemed like a place of judgment, now pulsed with new energy. The walls that had witnessed so many condemnations were beginning to hear the stories of redemption. I also felt the change within myself. The wounds I carried began to heal, and the shame that accompanied me, little by little, dissipated. It was as if a new light was illuminating not only the space, but also the darkest corners of my heart. As the early afternoon hours unfolded, the conversations became more fervent. Women talked about their experiences, and men were willing to listen. Tears were common, but now there was also laughter and hugs, a mix of pain and relief. What was once a space of repression was transformed into a sanctuary of freedom and acceptance. But even with the change happening, I knew there was a long road ahead. The voices that once called for condemnation had not completely disappeared. They were still present, silent, but ready to resurface. The fear of what might come next still hung over us. However, the courage that had emerged that day was a powerful force, and together we were stronger. Now more than ever, I felt that each of us had a role to play. The consequences of our actions were not just on ourselves, but on the community we were creating. The journey of transformation had begun, and I knew that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we were ready to face them. The light of hope had lit in our hearts, and together, we could shape a future where compassion and acceptance prevailed over fear and judgment. The murmur of conversation slowly began to dissipate, and a reverent silence took over the temple. Jesus' gaze, fixed and serene, still illuminated the room. He had challenged not just the Pharisees, but all of us to reconsider our perceptions of guilt and redemption. I knew what came next would be crucial. The woman who had been brought here, accused and humiliated, was now at the center of a transformation that would transcend the pain of her past. As if he had read our hearts, Jesus approached her, still standing. The expression on his face was a mixture of compassion and firmness. "Woman," he said softly, "where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" The woman, stunned and still in shock, looked around. The Pharisees had scattered, and the only one left was the man who had defended her, the one who seemed to have an authority she had never experienced. "No, sir," she replied, her voice still shaking. "Nobody condemned me. Neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared, and as he spoke these words, an immense weight lifted from her heart. "Go and sin no more." The simplicity and depth of his message resonated with us all. Forgiveness was not just a release from the chains of the past. It was an invitation to a new life, a new choice. The woman left, and I saw a mixture of relief and determination in her eyes. She was no longer just an accused. Now, she became a witness to divine love and mercy. The scene unfolding before me was, without a doubt, a reflection of the divine justice that Jesus exemplified. He did not ignore the gravity of sin, but offered the opportunity for change and renewal. The truth that was revealed was that despite our failures, there is always a path to redemption. Jesus' compassion was not a sign of weakness, but a powerful affirmation that every human being has value and deserves a new chance. As murmurs of hope and renewal spread through the crowd, I couldn't help but reflect on the lessons emerging from the experience. First, I realized that human judgment is often superficial and punitive, while divine love is deep and transformative. God's righteousness is manifested not only in correction, but in restoration. He calls us to look beyond guilt and see the potential in each life. On the other hand, the responsibility also lies with us. Those words of Jesus were a powerful reminder that if we are truly followers of him, we must practice mercy and compassion. Change doesn't just happen in us, but through us. Each interaction, every choice we make, can be an opportunity to reflect the light of Christ to those around us. Over the days, the story of that woman and the impact of Jesus' words spread throughout the community. The conversations that had begun in the temple became a movement towards social and spiritual transformation. The lessons of love, forgiveness, and acceptance echoed in our hearts, creating a new environment where people were encouraged to share their struggles and seek support in each other. Which initially seemed to be a day of condemnation became a testimony of God's mercy. Divine justice, far from severe retribution, has proved to be an invitation to redemption. That woman now frees not only found forgiveness, but has also become a symbol of hope for many. And so, in the midst of chaos and pain, the light of divine love shone more intensely, reminding us that all of us, regardless of our past, have a place in the heart of God and the opportunity for a new beginning. As she watched the woman to move away, she still felt the weight of Jesus' words echoing in my mind and heart. The moment was not just a scene of forgiveness. It was an invitation to a journey of spiritual transformation that we are all called to follow. Faith is not a mere belief in dogmas or rituals, but a living and dynamic relationship with God. The woman, upon receiving forgiveness, not only freed herself from her chains, but was also invited to walk in a new direction. This direction is marked by obedience and the choice of a life that reflects the light of Christ. Obedience should not be seen as an imposition, but as an answer to the love we receive. Jesus did not condemn her, but also encouraged her not to continue on the way that had led her to pain and suffering. This is a powerful lesson for us. True repentance involves a life change, a desire to follow the teachings of Christ, and a commitment to live according to his will. In the light of this event, I realize that each of us carries its own struggles and scars. We are often quick to point our fingers and judge, forgetting that we are all vulnerable in error. The story of that woman reminds us that instead of being judges, we must be instruments of love and compassion. As we come across those who made a mistake, our attitude must be that of welcome and forgiveness, just as Jesus did. This does not mean ignoring the truth about sin, but offering a path of restoration and hope. In our daily lives, we are often confronted with situations where forgiveness and compassion are needed. Whether in family conflicts, misunderstandings between friends, or even in our community, we can be the voice that encourages change and reconciliation. As we choose mercy instead of judgment, we not only reflect the character of Christ, but we also help to create an environment where others feel safe to open and seek help. The lesson I get from this account is that, like the woman who found forgiveness, we all have the opportunity to rewrite our stories. God's love is a constant invitation to start again, regardless of how far we have gone. When we come across our own mistakes, we must remember that grace is always offered, and the possibility of change is within our reach. The final message is clear. As we approach God, we must also approach each other with love and compassion. True transformation begins in our hearts and radiates into the world around us, showing that even in darker situations, there is always room for light, hope, and divine love. It is a call to action, faith, and the practice of mercy that unites us as a community and brings us closer to the heart of God.